A 13-year-old girl from a small town, vanished without a trace on a summer night in 1981. A troubled childhood filled with foster homes, family turmoil, and abuse, her life had already been marked by tragedy. One evening, she disappeared from her home in Seaside, California, gone in the blink of an eye. Her parents didn't report her missing, and for over 20 years, no one knew what had happened. But in the most shocking twist of all, the truth would only come to light recently, more than 2 decades after she vanished. Mary Louise Day was born on February 19, 1968, in Little Falls, New York. Her early years were anything but typical. The daughter of Charlotte and Charles Day, Mary's childhood was marked by a series of upheavals, both emotional and physical. Charlotte and Charles's marriage faltered, and the family life that Mary had hoped for quickly dissolved. As the turbulence in the household escalated, Mary and her 2 younger sisters, Kathy and Sherry, found themselves in and out of foster homes. The reasons behind their foster care placements were never fully disclosed, but the effects of that instability were clear. The girls had witnessed more than their share of disruption and pain before reaching their teens. During the years in foster care, Charlotte would divorce Charles and eventually remarry a man named William Houle. William, a man who would play a pivotal role in Mary's life, was enlisted in the United States Army. His arrival into the family didn't bring stability but only more turbulence. By 1975, the Houles moved to Hawaii, where William's military service stationed them. But it wasn't just the geographical move that added to the instability. The girls, especially Mary, were caught in the fallout of the new family dynamics. While Mary and her younger sister Kathy remained in the fold, Sherry was left behind. By the time the family relocated to Hawaii, Sherry had been legally adopted by another family, separating her from her biological siblings. This rift would set the stage for later confusion and heartbreak. As Charlotte and William continued their lives in Hawaii, they would have another child, a son named William Jr. By now, Mary and Kathy had already witnessed their fair share of family trauma, but the worst was still ahead. In December 1980, after years of turmoil, Mary's life took another sharp turn. She was removed from her mother's and stepfather's care after it was discovered that William had been physically abusing her. At just 12 years old, Mary was taken into protective custody, but soon after, she was sent to join the rest of her family in Seaside, California. The move should have been a fresh start, but the ghosts of her past followed her. Seaside, a small coastal town in California, was meant to be a place of respite, but for Mary, it became another chapter in her troubled life. In Seaside, Mary struggled to adapt to a new home and life. Her relationship with her stepfather remained strained, and she often sought escape, attempting to run away multiple times. Yet, each time, she was brought back, and little was done to help her break free from her painful past. Her parents claimed she was rebellious, but no one fully understood the depth of the turmoil Mary was facing. July 15, 1981, began as just another summer night in Seaside. But as the evening wore on, it would mark the start of a terrifying and tragic chapter in the Day family's life. While the rest of the family went out to dinner, Mary was left alone at home. The house, usually filled with the sounds of family and the hum of everyday life, stood silent as Mary found herself once again caught in the painful web of her troubled home. Kathy, Mary's younger sister, would later recall that night with chilling clarity. She was at the house with Mary when an argument broke out between Mary and William. The conflict, like many before it, escalated quickly. Kathy would later recall hearing the shouting growing louder, her heart pounding in her chest. She described how, during the heated argument, she saw her sister, Mary, covered in blood. Kathy didn't understand the full extent of what had happened, but she knew something was wrong, something that would soon change everything. The next morning, when Kathy awoke, Mary was gone. The house, once filled with tension and chaos, had become eerily quiet. Kathy was left with a haunting question: what had happened to her sister? When she asked her mother where Mary had gone, Charlotte's response was chilling in its simplicity: Mary had run away. It was the same excuse Charlotte would repeat to others, over and over again. But this time, it didn't sit right with Kathy. She didn't believe her mother's version of events. Kathy knew better. She had seen the blood on Mary's mouth, heard the violence in her stepfather's voice, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. Yet, when she asked Charlotte more questions, she was met with silence. Mary's name seemed to vanish from their conversations, as if the family had agreed to never speak of it again. Over time, Charlotte and William's behavior became more erratic. Kathy was warned not to ask about Mary again, and when they moved away from Seaside to New York, Mary's absence remained shrouded in secrecy. To the outside world, it was as if Mary had simply disappeared, vanishing without a trace. The Houles moved on with their lives, but the questions surrounding Mary's disappearance lingered in Kathy's mind. It wasn't until years later, when Kathy and Sherry began to speak to each other about their memories, that the truth started to emerge. Sherry, who had been living in a different state, began to piece together a story that didn't align with what Charlotte had told her. The pieces of the puzzle started to shift. Both sisters were left wondering, had their mother been hiding something? What was the real story behind Mary's disappearance? As Kathy and Sherry began to question their mother, they discovered that Charlotte's explanations were filled with holes. At one point, Charlotte even claimed that Mary had run away to live a life of drugs and prostitution. Yet no evidence ever surfaced to back these claims. It became clear to Sherry that Charlotte had a disturbing lack of concern about what had happened to her daughter. And then, when Sherry began to remember strange, offhand remarks Charlotte had made, such as her knowing locations in California where a body could be hidden, she couldn't help but wonder, had Mary been murdered that night? The more they uncovered, the less it seemed that Mary had just disappeared. For over a decade, the mystery of Mary Louise Day's disappearance lingered in the shadows. No one knew where she was, and no one had the answers. But her sister, Sherry, refused to let the case go unsolved. In 1992, more than a decade after Mary's disappearance, Sherry took matters into her own hands and filed a missing persons report. She hoped that the police might finally take action. But to her dismay, the response was cold: no leads, no search, and no real investigation. For years, the authorities failed to dig deeper, leaving the family's questions unanswered. Despite the police's indifference, Sherry did not back down. She continued to search for answers, determined to uncover what had happened to her sister. As the years passed, Sherry worked tirelessly on her own, collecting the few pieces of information she could find. She reached out to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, sending in a photograph of Mary and details about her disappearance. From this, an age-progressed image was created, an eerie, yet hopeful, representation of what Mary might look like now, at 31 years old. The image, though haunting, provided Sherry and Kathy with the only semblance of hope that they might one day find Mary. Still, the search for answers seemed fruitless. With each passing year, the case seemed to slip further into obscurity, swallowed by the countless other unsolved mysteries in the files of the police department. But in 2002, a breakthrough finally came, though not in the way Sherry or Kathy had hoped. As Fort Ord, a nearby military base, was being shut down, old cold cases, including Mary Louise Day's disappearance, were revisited. For the first time in over 20 years, the investigation was reopened. However, the sense of urgency was not felt by all involved. The case, now over 2 decades old, had so many unanswered questions that it seemed almost impossible to piece together. For Kathy and Sherry, the reopening of the case stirred up old feelings, and with those feelings came growing suspicions that William Houle, Mary's stepfather, may have been involved in her disappearance. The more they reflected on their memories of that night, the more convinced they became that Mary had not run away, as they had been told. The blood on Mary's mouth, Kathy's recollections of the violence between Mary and William, and Charlotte's strange, cold reaction, all pointed to something far more sinister. Kathy, especially, began to remember more vivid details from the night of Mary's disappearance. She recalled her stepfather's anger, his violent outbursts, and his strange behavior after Mary vanished. As Kathy's recollections grew clearer, she began to question everything her mother had told her. Why had Charlotte never really searched for Mary? Why had she been so insistent that Mary had run away, even when no one else seemed to believe it? Sherry's suspicions grew, too. The more she investigated, the more she realized how little Charlotte seemed to care about Mary's fate. And the strange comments Charlotte made in later years, especially about knowing places in California where a body could be hidden, only fueled Sherry's belief that the truth was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. 22 years had passed since Mary Louise Day disappeared from her Seaside, California home. Her family had endured years of uncertainty, and the authorities had moved on to other cases. But in November of 2003, everything would change. A routine traffic stop in Phoenix, Arizona, led to an astonishing discovery, one that would finally bring the long-running mystery to the surface. On that night, an officer pulled over a vehicle for having stolen license plates. Inside the truck was a woman who was detained, and when her identification was checked, something startling came to light. The woman was carrying an Arizona state ID that bore the name Mary Day. The name was unmistakable, but the situation didn't add up. Mary Louise Day had been missing for more than 2 decades, and the woman in the truck certainly didn't appear to be the same child who had vanished from Seaside. At first, investigators were skeptical. How could this woman be Mary Day? She had a thick Southern accent, completely different from Mary's Californian roots. Her story was filled with contradictions, and she gave vague, incoherent details about her life after disappearing. She claimed to have run away from her family to escape the abuse of her stepfather, but her narrative didn't quite match what was known about Mary's case. Questions about her true identity surfaced immediately. Could this woman really be Mary Louise Day, or was she an imposter? And why had she been using a stolen ID? With these mounting doubts, investigators ordered a DNA test to confirm the woman's identity. The results would come as a shock. After over 2 decades of unanswered questions, DNA testing confirmed that the woman detained in Phoenix was indeed Mary Louise Day. The truth had finally emerged, though it came with more questions than answers. Though the DNA test confirmed her identity, the woman's recollections of her life in the years following her disappearance raised new doubts. Mary's family, especially her sisters Kathy and Sherry, were shocked by the discrepancies in her story. While the DNA match proved it was Mary, her inability to remember key details from her past, like the family's inheritance codeword Mohawk, and her confusing behavior cast a shadow over the reunion. Despite the DNA test that confirmed the identity of the woman detained in Phoenix as Mary Louise Day, something was amiss. The woman, now in her 30s, exhibited behavior that raised immediate doubts. The woman who had reappeared was not the same child who had vanished from Seaside, California, over 2 decades earlier. The disconnect between the woman before them and the girl they had lost was profound. As Sherry, Mary's sister, struggled to reconcile the woman she believed was her long-lost sister, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sherry had been waiting for this moment for years, but now that it was happening, the reunion was nothing like she had imagined. Mary's erratic behavior and the gaps in her memory caused Sherry to question the woman's true identity. Despite the overwhelming evidence of a DNA match, the connection felt distant, like the woman in front of her was a stranger, not the sister she had once known. Mary's erratic behavior continued to raise concerns. She spoke in circles, offering confusing and fragmented recollections about her past. She struggled to remember significant details, such as family events or the code word Mohawk, which Mary and her sisters had used to discuss the inheritance they had received after their father's death. More troubling still was Mary's inability to recall her life prior to her disappearance with any clarity. For Sherry, this was a stark contrast to the sister she remembered. Sherry, who had spent years yearning for answers, now found herself caught in a web of uncertainty. Her sister had returned, but the person sitting in front of her didn't seem to be the same person who had vanished all those years ago. Mary's memories were scattered and disjointed, as if pieces of her life had been lost in the fog of time. Sherry was torn between the relief of having her sister back and the growing suspicion that this woman wasn't really Mary. As Sherry spent more time with the woman, she began to notice other troubling signs. Mary, who had once been outgoing and energetic, now seemed withdrawn and emotionally distant. There were moments of confusion, where Mary would contradict herself or fail to recognize things she should have known, details about her childhood, her relationships, and even basic aspects of her personality. Sherry began to wonder, was this truly her sister, or had the years of separation and trauma turned her into someone else entirely? Mary's struggle with her identity was apparent in more ways than one. She had developed issues with alcoholism and was prone to emotional outbursts. Sherry couldn't help but notice the deep scars Mary carried, scars that weren't just physical, but psychological. Years of trauma and uncertainty had left their mark, and the emotional toll seemed to weigh heavily on the woman now standing before her. But these issues only added to Sherry's doubts. Could the woman she was looking at truly be the sister she had lost all those years ago? Or had her sister's trauma reshaped her into someone unrecognizable? Sherry's suspicion grew as she began to notice patterns in the woman's behavior. She would often recount events that didn't make sense, leaving Sherry and others questioning the validity of her memories. The inconsistencies in Mary's recollections about the events surrounding her disappearance, such as the argument with her stepfather, left Sherry wondering if the woman truly was her sister. She also noticed discrepancies in the woman's claims about her life after running away. Mary's past was as fragmented as the story she told, leaving her family grappling with the possibility that they would never fully understand what had happened during those 22 missing years. The more Sherry tried to piece together the truth, the more complicated the situation became. While she was desperate to believe that the woman before her was truly Mary, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Sherry was torn between accepting the woman as her sister and confronting the harsh possibility that this person, despite the DNA match, might not be the sister she had been hoping to find. Mary's life after her disappearance remained shrouded in confusion. She spent her final years living in Missouri, where she married and experienced further hardship. Yet, despite the passage of time and her attempt to settle into a new life, the questions surrounding her disappearance and true identity remained unanswered. Mary's marriage in Missouri was marred by the same patterns of abuse that had haunted her for much of her life. She married a man with the last name Jessler, and their relationship was troubled from the start. Reports later indicated that her husband was abusive, continuing the cycle of trauma that Mary had faced since her early years. This marriage, just like the years leading up to it, seemed to be another chapter of hardship and turmoil for Mary. Yet, even in the years following her marriage, Mary's struggle to find peace continued. Though she was physically in Missouri, emotionally, she remained adrift. Her past, full of disjointed memories and trauma, continued to haunt her. Throughout her life, Mary had never fully addressed the painful questions surrounding her disappearance, and as she moved from place to place, it seemed that the weight of those unresolved mysteries only grew heavier. As Mary tried to build a life for herself in Missouri, the unresolved issues of her identity never truly faded. Her family, especially her sister Sherry, struggled to come to terms with the woman she had become. Though they hoped the truth would eventually come to light, Mary's own inability to provide answers left them feeling more uncertain than ever. What had happened to Mary during those missing 22 years? Why had she returned so changed, with so many gaps in her memory? In 2017, Mary passed away in Missouri, but even in death, the questions about her life remained. Her death did little to ease the unresolved feelings within her family. Sherry, who had fought so hard to bring her sister back, was left to grapple with her emotions, feeling both a deep sense of loss and the painful reality that she would never fully understand what had happened to Mary all those years ago. Mary Louise Day's story is a stark reminder of how family secrets, pain, and trauma can fester in silence. The passage of over 2 decades without any answers left a void for her family, one that only grew deeper with time. Even after Mary's return in 2003, the truth behind her disappearance and the person she became remain unclear. The woman who reappeared in Phoenix was confirmed through DNA to be Mary, yet the fragmented details of her life after 1981, the emotional scars, and the inconsistencies in her memories left the mystery unsolved. What happened during those missing years? Why did Mary's story remain incomplete? Who was the woman who returned to her family, and what had she endured during those years away? The questions that remain unanswered continue to haunt those closest to Mary. Sherry, her sister, never stopped searching for the truth, but the revelations that came were never enough to truly understand the life Mary had led during her absence. In the years that followed, there was no final closure, only a series of unresolved emotions and lingering doubts. The death of Mary Louise Day in 2017 did not bring the relief her family had hoped for. Instead, it left them with a sense of disillusionment. The woman they had waited for all those years was gone, but the questions about her life, the truth behind her disappearance, remained suspended in time. Despite the DNA match, despite the confirmation that this woman was indeed Mary, there was no satisfying explanation for what had happened. Was the woman who returned really Mary? Or was she someone who had taken her place? What happened to Mary during those 22 years of silence? Mary's return brought some semblance of answers, but those answers only raised more questions. The fragmented memories she carried and the years spent away from her family left an indelible mark on the woman who returned. Despite the years of longing, Sherry and her family could never fully reconcile the person Mary had become with the girl they had lost. What do you think happened to Mary Louise Day? Was the woman who returned truly Mary, or was it someone else entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today. The story of Mary Louise Day is one of loss, confusion, and unanswered questions. Despite the years of waiting in the pursuit of truth, some stories remain incomplete. If you found this case as compelling as we have, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Don't forget to comment with your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep questioning the world around you.